I, Sarim Khan here, am very glad and honored that I can stand here and address to all of you. So first of all, thanks to Yes India Foundation and thanks to Mr. Shaukat Bukhari sir for giving me this opportunity to present in front of you all. I'd like to start with a quotation said by Mr. Albert Einstein, who is a well-known name in physics. He once said that knowledge is what you remember even when you forget everything else. And I very much agree with this quotation. True knowledge isn't really what you can memorize, the data, the statistics that you can memorize. It is what you understand. It is how you perceive this world. In fact, to be very honest, on what I'm going to address to all of you, well, it is actually a physics topic. And my apologies if you're bored by it, because I personally, from the field of physics, very much believe that that is the thing I should be addressing on. Anything else that I address on, well, that I'm not an expert on, will really lead to many misconceptions and falsifications. So, well, as I told you that knowledge is not really about craving statistics or data, I still do not remember the proportionality constant used in Einstein's field equations, which does not mean that I don't understand the equations. I really don't know what statistics or what data Cavendish used to derive the gravitational constant, which doesn't mean that I don't understand what the gravitational constant is or what it does. And I don't remember the dimensions of the gravitational constant. But I believe, still say that I understand how gravitation works, or at least what it does, and how the concept came to be. What do we really mean by gravitation? So, as I said, that knowledge is about how you perceive this world. So, I perceive the world in terms of the laws of physics. So, as I said, I perceive the world in terms of the laws of physics. One simple law of physics is the law of gravitation. Now, this is one very simple law, extremely simple, that even a little kid can understand, but it has profound implications. And believe me, this is definitely one of the most remarkable, one of the greatest achievements of mankind throughout history. What is the law of gravitation? Well, let's start with something very basic, and that is that when you see an apple breaks from a tree, it falls down. And we all know about Sir Isaac Newton's story that he saw an apple fall and he concluded that there is something called gravitation or something called gravity that makes objects fall. That isn't quite the full story here. What Newton really asked himself when he sees an apple fall, and we don't really know if the story of the apple falling is true or not, but we can always take it at its face value. He asks to himself that if the apple falls, does the moon also fall? And it is a very important question, one of the most important questions asked it throughout history. If the apple falls, does the moon also fall? Surprisingly, the answer is yes, the moon does fall. But we don't really say it closing into the earth. How does it fall then? Well, the moon falls around the earth. That is the answer Newton gave to himself. But any qualitative answer that you give to yourself is merely a speculation. The point of a scientific theory is what you can do with that theory. If you can take in a small input of data and given a very large output of data, that is really what qualifies a theory as a good theory. As Richard Feynman himself mentions it in his Feynman lectures on physics, that is the kind of definition Feynman uses for classifying a theory as a good theory. What could Newton really do with his law of gravitation? Let's start somewhere from pre-Newton era, and that is from the era of Johannes Kepler and Galileo Galilei. Kepler gave his three laws of planetary motion based on the empirical observations made by his teacher Tycho Brahe. And Brahe made some observations regarding orbits, the planetary orbits. There was still debate about whether the Earth orbits the Sun or whether it is the Sun that orbits the Earth. But one common consensus among all was that the other planets do in fact orbit something. It is either the Earth or the Sun. So Brahm made some empirical observations and he listed down his results. And then comes along his student Johannes Kepler, and he based on that assumption that the Earth is the one orbiting around the Sun, along with all the other planets known at the time. He concludes his statement with three simple principles, three simple laws. The three laws of planetary motion. Now, Kepler's laws, what exactly are they? Well, allow me to tell you. The first Kepler law says that every planet orbits, has an elliptical orbit around the Sun, where the Sun is at one focus of the ellipse. What exactly is an ellipse? An ellipse is a very interesting shape, really. Why? Because here you consider 2 points which are called the focus of this ellipse. So you have a focus here and you have a focus here. The ellipse is nothing but the shape that you can draw around these 2 points. They're not exactly centers because the center would lie somewhere in between them. The focus are here at these ends. So you draw a kind of curve around these 2 points such that any point at the curve is always at equal distance. The sum of distances from that point to the either of the focus is always constant. So if you consider a point here and you add the distance between this point in the first focus and the point in the second focus, and then you consider a point on this particular arc here, and you add this distance from that point to the first focus and that point to the second focus. So the two total distances are always equal. This is the literal definition of an ellipse. So it is quite the interesting shape. And another thing that makes it very interesting is the Kepler's first law, where he tells that the orbit of planets is not circular as believed previously, which was due to Copernicus, Nicholas Copernicus, who was the first person to state that the Earth is the one orbiting the Sun, and which quite didn't match with the experimental observations. And so Kepler explains it, that theory didn't match with the experimental observations because Copernicus gave us a wrong idea that the orbit is circular. The orbit isn't circular, it is elliptical. And the Sun is placed at one focus of the orbit. What is at the other focus? Well, nothing. There need not be anything. Kepler then gives his second law, and this law is basically that if you consider any given time period and you consider the area that a line from this planet and the Sun will sweep, and you consider equal amount of duration at a later time instant, then the area that the line between the planet and the Sun will sweep, these two areas will be equal. So what we call it is the rate as the aerial velocity, and this aerial velocity is always constant. So the rate at which area is swept by the line between a planet and a Sun, that is always constant. And then Kepler gives his third law of planetary motion, and that is that the square of time period is proportional to the cube of the semi-major axis. The time period is really the time that a planet will take to cover the entire orbit once. And the semi-major axis is a particular kind of length in this ellipse. Now, these are three simple laws, and well, they describe a lot of things. They describe almost everything that you want to know about planetary orbits. So, they can't really give you very quantitative predictions, but they do explain a lot of things qualitatively about the planetary orbits. The trouble is, Kepler didn't quite know what sets the planets in motion and why don't they come to rest. And well, here comes Sir Isaac Newton with his law of gravitation. Isaac Newton asks himself that if the apple falls, does the moon also fall? And he goes on to perform some calculations. What kind of calculations? Well, Newton invents calculus, first of all. He discovers the three laws of motion and uses them as postulates of his theory of Newtonian mechanics, and uses these to really explain what this kind of force, what this attraction is between the earth and the sun, or between the moon and the earth. And he says that you really don't need to push the planets around to keep them in orbits. Rather, you need to push them perpendicular, normal to the orbits. And that is quite a strange idea. So, what Newton essentially says is that if you have an object here and you want to, well, carry it forward, you need to push it in that direction. All right. And well, that's really Newton's second law of motion. So the rate at which the planet is going to change its speed or its direction is really proportional to, directly depends on how much you are pushing, how much strength are you exerting on that object, what force are you exerting on that object. But in this particular case, when you really want to keep the planets in orbit, so that isn't really the direction that you of force exerted on the planet by the sun. Because one thing was very clear, that it is really the sun doing something to the planets that make them go around, or else they would be orbiting around some other planet or some other celestial body. But it is really the sun that they are orbiting around. So it has to be the sun that is doing something to these planets. And Newton came to the idea that the sun is exerting some kind of force on these objects, on these planets. But this force, as I said, is not along the direction of motion but perpendicular. Why perpendicular? Well, Newton comes to the conclusion that if you push any object in any given direction in the direction of motion, the object speeds up. And if you push it away from the direction of motion in the opposite direction, it slows down. So to change the motion of that object, to change the direction of motion of the object, so if it moves here and you want to change its direction of motion to here, you need to exert a perpendicular force. And Newton saw that, well, that the planets don't fly off tangentially and they have to be kept in elliptical orbits. The forces have to be central, meaning it has to be from the center of the sun to the center of the planets, perpendicular to their directions of motion. And well, what did Newton really get from this? What conclusions could he draw? He uses the second planetary motion law, Kepler's second law, and Kepler's third law, and he discovers his law of gravitation. One very simple law that I'll state just now. And then from that law of gravitation, he is able to predict Kepler's first law. Now, this is one very important point here. Kepler's laws were based on empirical observations, and that Kepler, well, used to derive his laws, right? And then Newton uses two of these and he reproduces the third law, meaning that the law is somehow consistent with all three of Kepler's laws. And that is really how physics is done. We take some experimental observations, we try to induce from them some results, and from those results, we try to find more general laws that govern the universe. So, what was this Newton's law of gravitation? One simple law, that everything in the universe attracts everything else. And this force really depends on how massive both the bodies are, and it also depends on what the distance between the two bodies are. How exactly does it depend on those? Well, if a body is twice as massive as the other, so you have one object here, you have one object here, and they're always attracting each other. So if you replace this object with another object that is twice as massive, the force of attraction will suddenly be doubled. If you replace this object also by a similar object that has twice the mass, so here we have twice the mass here and twice the mass here, the force will now be 4 times previously. So that was one thing that Newton related. How much matter is composed in an object directly determines how much that object gravitationally attracts any other object. Another thing that Newton stated here was that if you double the distances, the force falls off by 1/4. That means doubling the distances decreases the force by 1/4 times. So if you have a force of 16 units and you double the distances, what is the force now? The force now is 4 units. If you double the distances again, the force now is 2 units. So the force really falls off inversely to the square of distances, meaning it really depends on the squares of distances rather than distances themselves, and inversely, as in increasing the distance decreases the force and decreasing the distance increases the force. So this is the law that Newton came up with and that he's credited widely with. Now, with it, he was able to predict a lot of other things. What things? Things like, why is the earth a sphere? I mean, it could be, well, any other shape. Why is the earth or the moon or Jupiter or the sun? Why are all these spherical bodies? And well, that is due to all this matter that we have around here. So consider the matter that composed the earth, all these rocks and all these gases. Well, they all come together and well, they all attract each other. Why do they attract each other? Well, that's the law of gravitation. Every object in the universe attracts every other object, even though the force is very small. So the reason why I'm not well being attracted by the table in front is because the force is extremely small. So the bodies have to be extremely massive for the force to be any significant. Well, how massive? As massive as the sun, or as massive as the moon, or as massive as the earth that keeps us glued to the ground. So only masses of these orders of these magnitudes can keep us glued to the ground. Any other smaller object won't have that much an effect on us. But we can really prove it that every object does this. And as I'll tell you shortly of the Cavendish experiment, that actually did prove that not only is it the earth or the sun or the moon or the celestial objects, but even a tiny ball attracts another tiny ball there. So Newton was able to know that why are these bodies spherical, and that is because all these particles, all this matter that composes these bodies attracted each other, and as they attracted each other and attracted each other, they want to come closer and closer to each other. Why? Because well, they are attracting each other, and they're always attracting no matter how close. The instant they get any closer, they'll attract each other with an even greater force, due to which they'll come even closer and attract each other with now an even greater force. When this happens, they want to come to each other as closest as possible. And well, what shape does that give us? That gives us a sphere. And this is the reason that the celestial bodies are spheres. Well, what about this mic just here? Why is this not a sphere? Because as I told, the gravitational force is an extremely weak force. So unless the bodies are really massive, the gravitational force does not show much effects, which is the reason this mic here is not a sphere. And it would be a really dull world, trust me, if everything in the world would be a sphere. So we should be thankful to the law of gravitation that gravity is an extremely weak force. But for objects as massive as the sun, it has to be a sphere. But you see that Earth isn't a perfect sphere. Why is that? Well, Newton was able to explain why Earth isn't a perfect sphere but slightly bulged out at the equator with his second law of motion. And he said that the Earth spins around. And due to the Earth spins around, there are what you call centrifugal effects at the equator, and they are not there at the north and the south poles. This Newton used his second law of motion to deduce that the Earth doesn't have to be a perfect sphere. And we know that the radius at the equator of the Earth is 21 kilometers more than the radius at the north or south poles. So there, Newton first makes a prediction that the Earth has to be a sphere by the law of gravitation, and which was quite already known at the time, except if you consider concepts of flat Earth, which are still going till the date today. And I don't really understand where do people get the idea of a flat Earth, considering it's really simple if you consider the law of gravitation that the Earth has to be a sphere. Every celestial body is a sphere, and why would you consider the Earth to be flat? And then Newton predicts with his second law of motion that it isn't a perfect sphere but bulged out at the equator through what are called the centrifugal effects. And well, we have verified to them to an accuracy, to as much accuracy as possible. So there Newton takes some very simple ideas, namely Kepler's laws of planetary motion there, and he formulates a law, a very general law that first he formulated for the planets only, and later only he generalized it to every body in the universe. And then he makes some predictions which really hold up to be true and which match with the next experiments conducted. And there is quite an interesting story here that Newton waited for around 4 years, if I recall correctly, before publishing his law of gravitation, even after he had completed the theory. Why is that? Because when he first tried to experimentally deduce some values, some numerical values, they didn't quite match with the observations. The reason was that the radius of Earth that the astronomers were using back then was actually a false radius. It wasn't a correct one. It was only 4 years later realized that the radius had been a wrong one, and when they measured it correctly and they reported it, and then Newton uses this new radius in his law of gravitation, everything works out perfectly. So whereas he had thought that the law of gravitation is a false one, 4 years later he finds that the experimental data was actually the false one. It was a mistake on the astronomer's part, not his part, and everything works out perfectly. Until date, we really know that gravity works at all the scales that we have looked at, that we have verified things to at. But what happened later was Newton wasn't exactly able to predict how much force there should be, given that there was a certain constant called the gravitational constant there. So even though he could make these predictions like the earth has to orbit the sun, and these orbits have to be elliptical, and why is everything in the universe, all the celestial objects that you can see, why are they spheres, or if they're not perfect spheres, they're slightly bulged out at their equators, it is due to his second law of motion. To actually carry out calculations of how much forces these gravitational forces, how strong they really are, he needed to know the value of a certain constant, which is now called the universal gravitational constant, and he didn't quite know the value. It was only later in the 1700s that another scientist, Henry Cavendish, performs an experiment. And therein he verified that everything in the universe, not just the object, not just the celestial bodies, but indeed everything, even a tiny ball attracts another tiny ball. So that experiment, which is now called the Cavendish experiment, also called the weighing the earth experiment, deduced the value of this universal gravitational constant. And after the universal gravitational constant was found, Cavendish was able to deduce the mass of the Earth. Now, we really know that we can't put the Earth on a weighing machine and check the results of what value that weighing machine gives. But this simple law, the universal law of gravitation, was able to weigh how massive the Earth really is. It is now able to weigh how massive the Sun is, or how massive the Andromeda galaxy has to be. So you see how such a simple law, that the force between two objects depends on how massive the objects are, and depends inversely to the square of what distances the objects are placed to it. This simple law can actually lead to such profound consequences, and it can tell you how massive the earth is, or how massive the sun is, or why every celestial body in the universe is actually spherical, or if they are not, why are they not spherical, due to these centrifugal effects that Newton predicted with his second law of motion. So, well, as I told you about the weighing of the Earth experiment, and it has been conducted many times, and we have had better values, more and more accurate values of universal gravitational constant every single time. The one problem that came in the Newton's law of gravitation was it wasn't consistent with the new physics that Einstein developed in the 1900s. And that, trust me, was a big problem in physics. Because what Einstein says in 1905 is that no influence in the universe can travel faster than the speed of light. One problem that the universal law of gravitation had, and I'm not blaming it on Sir Isaac Newton, because he didn't know special relativity back then, and he couldn't have known, because the whole conception of special relativity comes from Maxwell's electrodynamics and the Michelson-Morley experiment. So Newton would have to be 300 years ahead of his time to actually look into special relativity and formulate a better theory of gravitation. So it was Einstein who saw that there were troubles with the special theory of relativity that he himself developed, and Newton's law of gravitation. As I told you that nothing in the universe can have an influence that travels faster than the speed of light, as Einstein predicted in 1905. The problem with gravity is that if you place an object here and another object here, and what you do is there is a certain gravitational force between the two, what you have to simply do is pick this object from here and place it at a distance farther. If you double the distance, the force falls off one fourth time. This happens at an instantaneous rate as suggested by Newton. That is, the instant you pick it up and you place it somewhere farther, the force instantly falls. So this information is actually traveling faster than light. What information? The information that this object has been placed at a farther distance reaches this object, and the gravitational force between them reduces. since gravitational force is really a means of interaction between any two bodies, this is really information propagating from that body to this body, and it is propagating instantly. It is propagating faster than the speed of light, in contrary to what Einstein has suggested. So Einstein works on this issue 10 years, for 10 whole years, from 1905 to 1915. And then he comes up what Paul Dirac calls the greatest intellectual achievement in the history of mankind. He comes up with a theory that only three people in the entire world were able to understand at the time of its conception. Only three people. One, Albert Einstein himself. The other was Arthur Eddington. And the third person, although never officially stated, I suppose would be David Hilbert. And that was the general theory of relativity. And I myself consider the general theory of relativity to be the greatest intellectual accomplishment in the history of mankind. Why is it so? For one, Einstein was really ahead of his time when he suggested this theory, like really ahead of his time. And it's difficult to overstate how important the general theory of relativity is in physics and how ahead of time Einstein was when he developed this theory. Richard Feynman, as he says in one of his Feynman lectures, that he himself was trying to derive the laws of gravitation, general theory of relativity, from more of a different perspective. And when Feynman himself, years later, mind you, decades later, was trying to derive the general theory of relativity himself with more advanced mathematical methods developed, with more advanced field theories developed, he himself was not able to derive it using all the more advanced field theories that were already there, that were actually based on the general theory of relativity itself. So Feynman recalls of this and he tells about Einstein that it is as if Einstein was swimming underwater with his hands tied to his back and himself being blindfolded. That was how Einstein came up with the general theory of relativity. And so it still doesn't make any sense how Einstein was able to come up with something that original and something that ahead of his time. But today we can understand the theory better, and in this time, with the more advanced mathematical methods that we have, we can actually understand how general relativity works. What is the theory about? Well, Einstein relates gravitation with the concept of space time itself. So, as in 1905, Einstein suggested that space and time are not absolute to observers. That is, one man's space is another man's space and time. One man's time is another man's space and time. So, space and time are together tangled. He didn't quite suggest it himself. He more like gave the general physics of the things, and it was his math professor at his university, his former math professor actually, Hermann Minkowski, who formulated the same theory in more of a geometrical manner, in what today we call Minkowski's space-time. So here we can see that space and time are not as distinct as we thought they are, and every object in the universe really travels through time always, always and always. And anything that has mass, anything that is least bit of massive, will always travel through time, and it cannot stop through that. And well, this tangled space-time that we can consider, all objects will always travel through those at what you call the speed of light, 3 times 10 to the power 8 meter per second. When an object has to travel through space, what it simply does is borrows some of its speed through time and transforms it through its speed through space. So as I'm walking here, what I'm essentially doing is that I had along been traveling in space time at the speed of light, and as I'm walking here, I'm really borrowing my speed from the time dimension or from space time as a whole and transforming it into space only, due to which I am now moving faster through space and a little slower through time, which is why time for me is different than time from anyone else sitting here. And this Minkowski gives the reason for time dilation. And initially, Einstein didn't really like the reformulation of his theory, a more mathematical formulation, a geometrical formulation. And he says in a letter to one of his friends that now the mathematicians have complicated the theory of relativity. I myself do not understand it. But it was only later that Einstein would realize how important this geometric formulation would be. As in his general theory of relativity, he used this geometric formulation only. And well, that was that you have space time, you have the fabric of space time, and objects Matter in the universe, anything that has mass, anything that has energy, curves this fabric of a space time. And any other object that moves through it has to move through this curved space time. And well, that it has to move through curved space time, it initially wants to follow a straight path, and it does follow a straight path. Why is it that the light deflects around the sun or the planets move in elliptical orbits around the sun? There is the force of gravitation between planets and the sun. The reason is that if the sun were not there, any simple planet would simply fly off tangentially. It would fly off tangentially at a constant speed in a constant direction. But that you place the sun there curves the space and the time around which the planet lies in the vicinity of it itself, and the planet is still moving in a straight line, except it is moving in a straight line in a curved space in a curved time. And the reason we see that the planet's arc is curved, its path is curved, and it is moving around the sun, it is not because the planet is actually does want to move around the sun like that. The planet really wants to move in a straight line, but the space itself is curved, that makes the it appear that the planet is really moving in a curved direction, in a curved arc. And well, this is one very strange idea and it is difficult to understand. I mean, the concepts of it can easily be explained to someone, that planets are really moving in curved space times and all that. And it is a geometrical formulation. You can really formulate the theory non geometrically in terms of dynamics alone. But the mathematics of general relativity is, trust me, very difficult. The standard mathematics of general relativity is what you call differential geometry. Differential geometry is basically tensor analysis on curved spaces. And tensor analysis itself is a rather difficult thing to do in mathematics. Tensors are difficult objects to play with in mathematics. And when you curve the spaces on which these tensor lies, the theory becomes even more difficult. So difficult that Einstein himself struggled with differential geometry. He had to take help with one of his mathematician friend, and he asked it, is there such a theory in mathematics that I could use to describe curved spaces and curved times? And his friend was a mathematician, had to himself look in the library and finally come up with this thing called differential geometry. That, well, yes, there is this theory of differential geometry that you'd have to learn, and well, it is extremely complicated and extremely difficult to do. And Einstein learns the theory, he himself struggles a lot with the theory, as it is some really advanced mathematics. You need to know a lot of mathematical prerequisites to actually understand how differential geometry works. So he based the theory on this differential geometry, and which is probably the reason why most physicists, in fact, almost all the physicists in the world, were not able to understand Einstein's theory. Because, for starters, it uses differential geometry that physicists of the time were not familiar with. The second thing, it introduces new mind-bending concepts of how space and time works. But today we know that the theory is correct. Well, how do we know it? Einstein predicted that the light that comes from distant stars to us and that passes from behind the sun has to be deflected, and it has to be deflected by this certain amount that my equations, that Einstein's equations predict, called the Einstein field equations. So he calculated by what degrees the light has to be deflected, and 4 years after the publication of the theory in 1999, Arthur Eddington was finally able to measure how much light has been deflected coming from that different distant star during a solar eclipse, and the theory turned out to be correct. The theory turned out to be giving the right results for the proper deflection cost. So this became a big news in the scientific community, not just in scientific community, but across the globe, making its headline making its headline to the newspapers that the Newtonian ideas were finally overthrown, that we don't do Newtonian mechanics anymore, we don't have the Newton's theory of gravity, we have another more refined theory of gravity. And that finally changed the way physicists perceive the concepts of space and the concepts of time. That was the general theory of relativity. And well, many attempts were later made to understand more clearly how gravity works, and trust me, we haven't really gone beyond Einstein yet. We are still standing on the shoulders of Einstein, as Newton would call it. Newton said, if I have seen farther than others, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. And that is really how we understand physics. We are all standing on the shoulders of giants. Einstein stood on the shoulders of Newton, building further from what Newton had left. And well, today we are standing on the shoulders of Einstein. We are trying to still understand his theory better and better. There have been numerous attempts to understand the deeper implications of how gravity works. And even though Einstein really modified our conceptions of space and time, we still haven't been able to understand why mass warps the space time. So, the fundamental mechanism behind gravity still remains to be solved. There have been many mechanisms suggested, but none of them truly worked out. One such mechanism was that there are numerous particles flying off through space, and these particles are always hitting other objects and imparting momentum in them. So, if you have my hand here, there are particles moving through this space that are hitting my hand in this direction, and there are particles that are hitting my hand from this direction, and since there are equal number of particles, my hand stays right here. But when you have something like a big massive object in front of my hand, so say something like this. So if I consider something more large, like if my hand were the earth and this thing right here would be the sun, there are particles hitting the earth from the right direction and there are particles from the left direction, but a lot of them have been blocked by the presence of this thing right here, due to which the net momentum that my hand experiences would be in this direction towards this. So this is how gravity works. But this theory did not work out correctly, because that would mean that as something moves through space, more momentum should be imparted into it in the opposite direction, because then the particles hit at a faster rate because it is moving towards these particles. That should mean that the body should slow down. But we know that anything that moves in space at constant speeds continues to move at constant speeds just by Newton's first law of motion. So the theory cannot possibly be correct. So this way, many mechanisms have been suggested to explain gravity. None of them worked out. And another problem that lies in it, that gravity cannot be explained as a quantum field theory. As we know, general relativity itself is a classical field theory. So it doesn't obey the laws of quantum mechanics. And well, the hypothetical particle that has been suggested, namely the graviton, has not been detected experimentally. So a lot of problems still lie with gravity, but what we know is that every single experiment that has been suggested and has been carried out has every single time reported results that can be predicted with Einstein's theory of gravity, with Einstein's general theory of relativity. So we know that at least whatever we have observed until now has been well properly predicted by Einstein field equations of his general theory of relativity. So even though we do not understand it, such a simple law, such a basic law can lead to such profound consequences. And that is one thing that I appreciate a lot in the laws of physics. Most laws of physics are this simple that you can write them in a single line and they can draw these conclusions, these great conclusions, and explain the great workings of the universe. But we still do not understand everything, as I said. And so we need the future generations to come up and try to understand these things, try to conduct researches, whether they do explain things or not. As we continue conducting researches, as we continue trying to understand in this very attempt to understand things, a path is lightened where we see how things really turn out to be, how things really work. I mean, not every research that you have not ever heard of really leads to nothing. I mean, well, before Einstein, a lot of people came up and tried to explain gravity. None of that worked out, but it doesn't mean that was useless. Einstein read them and he tries to understand what was wrong with those methods and what was wrong with that method and what was wrong with that method, and he tries to combine it into a theory where those failures do not lie. So failures themselves explain to us a lot of stuff that should not be present there for a better theory, right? So failures do help us a lot in understanding physics and understanding this universe. And so I really encourage the future generations to come up in the world of physics, in the world of mathematics, in the world of science, to come up with new researches to try to understand the workings of this beautiful universe that God has given to us. I mean, what better path to enlightenment, what better path to a good life than to understand this beautiful universe that Allah has created to us, that we are so delightful to lie. As Dr. Muhammad Qasim himself said a while ago, that I really hope, he said this, that I really hope that the next Nobel Prize in India should come from the Yes India Foundation. And that is something that I will personally myself look into. I really want to see, and I really want it to happen, that any of you sitting right there will bring the next Nobel Prize in physics or the next Fields Medal in mathematics, and that would be such an enlightening thing to see, such a beautiful sight to witness. So this way, I'd like to conclude my address, and thanks to you all for having the patience to listen.
Assalamualaikum, sir.
Walaikum
Sir,
assalam.
myself, Ayan, I have many questions, but first I will like to ask, sir, as the earth is spinning every time, from where this energy comes to the earth, so that's it's spinning.
So your question basically is that as the Earth continues to spin, where the energy to continue to spin comes from, right?
Yes, sir.
Well, we don't really need energy continuously imparting energy to something for it to keep happening, really. As Newton's first law of motion states, that everything that is at rest continues to be at rest, and everything that is in uniform motion continues to be in a uniform motion in a constant direction, unless imparted by some experiment, by some other agent, external agent. So the earth spins. And why does it spin? It's because the particles that formed the earth were spinning around, and it continues to spin, and it continues to possess that energy. You really don't need to continuously impart energy as per Newton's first law.
Sir, can energy be created?
Well, now this thing regarding energy conservation is really a controversial topic. The classical answer would be no, energy cannot be created or destroyed. But I won't lie to you, we really don't know the answer. And I myself am very confused by this thing, and I'm pretty sure almost everyone in the world is confused by it. There is a thing called quantum fluctuations, which says that there are continuously particles and antiparticles being formed and destroyed across the universe. And what else it says is that the values of energy at each point in space continuously changes. So you won't ever observe the creation of energy or its destruction, but it may be possible that it is created or destroyed. We do not know yet.
Sir, as you tell that energy cannot be created, so the tides are formed due to the moon gravitational pull. So it means that the energy to make tides is given by the gravitational pull of the moon. Sir, it means energy is created by the moon.
Well, it really does not mean that the moon is creating energy, as you can associate with every point in space some sort of energy. And the gravitational force itself communicates with a form of energy that you call the gravitational potential energy. So that the tides raise to certain heights, it means that, well, the tides are gaining what you call the kinetic energy, the energy of motion. And this is due to, as the tides are raised, the distance between them and the moon decreases. That this distance decreases means their gravitational potential energy decreases, and their energy of motion, kinetic energy, increases. So the total energy in the system really remains constant.
Sir, as on the earth, if I put this pen up, it gain a potential energy, and if I left it, it will fall because of its potential energy. But tides are lift up by the moon's gravitational pull, and it falls down not by the. It's fall down due to it contain potential energy. Sir, from where this potential energy come?
Well, we can't really speak of only the potential energy of the sun or of the earth or the moon. There really is the potential energy that is due to interaction between the pen and the earth, due to which the body falls down, that it has to decrease the potential energy and turn into the kinetic energy. For the tides, it is more like as the earth continues orbiting around the sun and the moon continues orbiting around the earth, the moon is attracting the tides. And so this potential energy that decreases in this case is the potential energy between the tides and the moon. So that really decreases as the tides raise up and their kinetic energy increases, and as they raise down, the potential energy increases and the kinetic energy decreases. The thing is that the energy, that the potential energy involved when you drop a pen, that is not the potential energy between the pen and the moon, that is due to the pen and the earth. So these are two different potential energies, one due to the moon and the other due to the earth.
Sir, I would like to ask the last question. I have many questions, but I would like to end my question. So my last question is, why the moon rotate around the earth, not the sun?
Well, the moon orbits around the earth, not the sun, because it is closer to the earth, so it experiences more gravitational attraction to the earth than it does to the sun. So it certainly does orbit around the sun because it orbits around the earth and the earth orbits around the sun. The moon also orbits around the sun. So it is really orbiting around the sun, but meanwhile, it is also orbiting around the sun, around the earth. So that is really what's happening.
Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Walaikum assalam.
So, my name is Sadia Mushtaq. I'm studying in 10th standard. I want to ask you a general question. Could you tell me about a project you led and what was your role and is it successful?
Well, I have had not many achievements in physics itself, to be very honest. But one thing that I really am interested in and I'm continuing to pursue right now is the conservation of energy only. So, the previous question asked by that boy was really personal, actually, considering this is the one thing that I'm looking into for the past few months. Is energy really conserved or not? And this is something I'm looking into it in the context of what you call quantum measurements. So, in quantum mechanics, one thing that is very peculiar about the theory is that you have a different theory for when you observe something and a different theory for when you don't observe it. Speaking on the scales of atoms and molecules, you have these wave-like characteristics. So a light behaves like a wave or an electron behaves like a wave. But the instant that thing interacts with something bigger, with something more massive, with something classical, so you have an electron here, it will naturally exhibit wave-like properties. But the instant that you observe it via some measurement apparatus, via something classical, it quickly changes to particle-like characteristics. So this is what you call the wave function collapse. That is, the electron can be at many different locations. It can report many different results of being at many different places when you make the measurements. But when you actually do make it, it is only found as a particle at one place only. So this is called the collapse of the wave function when the measurement is made. So when such measurements are made, is energy conserved locally or not? So that is what I'm personally looking into these days. I hope to find some results.
Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Walaikum assalam.
Myself, Firdaus Kausar. I am going to ask you a general question. As you know, we face challenges that seem impossible to overcome. So, have you ever faced a challenge that seemed impossible at first but eventually succeed? What step did you take to overcome it?
Well, I don't really consider myself a very successful person to speak on the issue. But if we talk about from a physics context only, there are lots of times when I'm looking through a textbook and I believe that this thing is impossible for me to comprehend. I won't ever be able to understand this thing, and it happens quite often. If I read a really advanced textbook today, it will happen today. So eventually, when I look up to the prerequisites, I study them and I learn the proper mathematics, it eventually comes in and I do understand that this thing. One thing that, well, time dilation really bugged me for a lot of time, and I didn't think that I would actually ever be able to understand this thing. Schrodinger equation, these kind of equations that you have, or the Wheeler-DeWitt equation or the Dirac equation, to really understand these things, I initially thought that I wouldn't ever be able to understand how all this works. But eventually, after studying it for long enough and after thinking over it, not just reading and writing and solving, but after thinking over it for a lot of time, I eventually was able to understand that thing, able to learn that thing. So what really you need to do when you have to overcome such challenges and you're learning is, well, keep reading that, keep writing about that, keep solving problems related to that, and keep thinking. Now, it may not come right away to you, and it is rarely something that happens consciously. But one night you may wake up and realize that you have finally understood that thing, or you're walking and you realize that, well, this problem that I've been facing for so long, I finally get the solution. That is really how I get lots of solutions. Like I'm doing some other activity, the solution just comes in. But that eureka moment just doesn't happen out of the blue. It happens due to delicate practice that you have put into that thing prior. And so once you do that, the solution will eventually come to you. You just need to keep doing that thing until it happens.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Walaikum assalam.
Myself Zaki Ahmed and I am integrated student. Sir, your words are very precious. I request you to let us know that how I have also am and my all friends have also am, and I hope that all also want to know that, and I also want to know that what's your aim? What your aim to be?
Well, I just want to keep learning physics and learning mathematics. Now, to say that I want a Nobel Prize is pretty big ambition, and well, I'd be really glad if I were to be ever awarded a Nobel Prize or a Fields Medal. But what excites me more than a Nobel Prize, or what excites me more than a professorship at a respected university, would be this path of learning itself. So, well, I have some values, and that is to understand the universe. I want to understand the universe we live in, a complete understanding of this universe. I mean, how beautiful it is to have understanding of everything that you see around yourself. So, which is why I solve physics or I solve mathematics, because it helps me learn more about the universe. So, I simply want to keep learning, to keep coming up with my own stuff, conducting researches in physics and mathematics. That is what I aspire to do.
Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Walaikum assalam.
I am Sheikh Abuzar from ESPN Amda School, and I wanted to ask you that what are your hobbies or your interest outside of your studies, and how they enrich your life?
Well, I don't have much of hobbies outside of physics and mathematics, really. I mean, when I get bored of physics, I do math. And I've recently been interested only in pure mathematics. And, well, for someone who loves physics to be interested in pure mathematics is a very remarkable thing, trust me, because the path of physics and the path of pure mathematics completely diverges. So when I'm bored of physics, I'll study some mathematics, then I'll study some physics. I like to talk to people about physics and mathematics. Yes, that you could classify as one of my hobbies. I like to talk to people and I like to answer their questions, as I'm doing right now. So I'm pursuing my hobby right now. And I like to answer questions. So that is what I really like to do in my free time.
Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Walaikum assalam.
It's Mag Nawaz from Reyes Punch. Sir, as also, before you also discussed about the predictions of the Newton on gravitational phenomena. So can you describe like how these predictions are different from the Einstein's predictions?
Well, for small objects of a weak enough gravitational fields, that is fields by which gravity is propagated, the predictions are quite similar that you can just ignore it. So say if I drop an apple from here, or if I throw a ball, then the difference that will come from about Einstein's predictions and Newton's predictions, this difference, well, more than so much difference will come about if you simply inhale on the ball. If a simple air molecule strikes on the ball. The actual differences come when you consider, for instance, the orbit of Mercury around the Sun, or the orbit of Sun around the center of the Andromeda galaxy. So Newton's results were largely based on, well, that objects in the universe attract each other by this simple law. Einstein's way of perceiving gravity is more due to not of it as a force. I mean, sure, you could consider gravity as a force still, and Einstein was very critical of a literal conception of the geometry of this idea, but you can really perceive gravity as a geometry of space-time. And the differences that come, say you have differences when you're traveling besides a black hole. In this particular case, what you'll really see is that gravity itself dilates time. So when you're in a higher gravitational field, close to something that exerts higher gravity on you, you will see that time for you is slowed down. And this is really how this information propagation is maintained. I mean, I explained you what problem lies between special theory of relativity and the gravitational theory, that information cannot propagate instantly as suggested by the special relativity. On the other hand, Newton's law suggests that this information is propagated instantly. So what really is happening here is that if you're in this region where there is some sort of gravity acting, time slows down for you than you would normally perceive. And since time is slowing down and this is space itself is changing around us, the geometry of space-time is changing as a whole. The information has to travel not through a straight line but through this curved space-time. So you can really see this gravitational time dilation is what prevents the information to be traveling instantly. And what speed does this information travel at? It travels exactly at the speed of light only. So gravity and gravitational waves travel at the speed of light. So this is really the difference between Newton's theory of gravity and Einstein's theory of gravity, with Einstein's theory giving us better results in higher gravitational fields.
Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Walaikum assalam.
So it's me, Wahiz Manzoor from Royce Punch. So as a physics student, I have a question. Why does gravitational force follow inverse square law rather than inverse cube? Explain this.
Now that's a very good question. And if I keep aside Einstein's theory and say that Newton's laws are basically approximations of Einstein's theory for weaker gravitational fields, because it doesn't really make any sense to explain something in terms of more advanced theories, because the more advanced theories themselves are based on the simpler laws. So Einstein derived his law based on Newton's law, even though Newton's law is an approximation. And the answer is that we don't know. We really don't know why it follows inverse square law instead of inverse cube law or the inverse linearly distance. So you have it proportional inversely to the distance itself instead to some power of distance. So we don't know the answer, truth be told. What we do know is that if we consider the electromagnetic force instead, so this thing that the electromagnetic force follows an inverse square law is, well, without this Gauss law would not be true, and without that we wouldn't have our complete theory of electrodynamics. So you can say that the electromagnetic force follows the inverse square law for it to follow the Maxwell's equations, which are again based on this. So if I were to suggest an accurate answer with a no-nonsense approach, the answer would be we don't know. But if we were to do some hand holding in between that this is happening due to this and due to this and due to this, you may explain it. It is deeply connected to the electromagnetic force in their forms. The electromagnetic force is that way because if you have some sort of object and you place charge inside it, some spherical metallic object, all the charge goes to the surface of that and there is no charge left inside. If it were an inverse distance or an inverse cube, there would be charge left inside. So that there is no charge left inside, it means this square is actually precise. It is inverse square only. So you can, in terms of that, formulate the electromagnetic theory and say that the form of electromagnetism is really the same as the form of gravitation.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa
Walaikum assalam.
barakatuhu. Sir, I'm Ikra Majid from Rohis Punj. As in physics, electromagnetic forces arise from the interactions of the charged particles, and it is explained through fields and photons as mediators. However, gravity being despite one of the fundamental forces. So my question is that why can't gravity explain similar to as the electromagnetic force, and how it is fundamentally different?
Well, now this is a very good question, truth be told. And we really don't know that why gravity cannot be explained by that, since we know that almost everything in physics is explained by what you call the quantum field theory. So you have a quantum field theory for the electromagnetic force, you have a quantum field theory for the strong nuclear force, and you have a quantum field theory for the weak nuclear force. These are described as quantum electrodynamics, quantum chromodynamics, and quantum fluorodynamics respectively. The problem is that trying to formulate quantum field theory of gravity leads to such a theory that is what you call non-renormalizable. So there is this certain process, this certain mathematical procedure that you call renormalization that helps you take out all the infinities that arise in your equations. So if I try to explain any classical force or even a quantum force through what you call a quantum field in physics, you are eventually going to run into infinities, and to take these infinities away from the equation, you are going to have to use the renormalization procedures. Now, a renormalization is only a mathematical trick. It has no physical significance and we haven't found a better approach yet. But when you try to do the same thing for gravity, a quantum field theory of gravity cannot be renormalized, so the infinities remain in the equation. How this is really done is that you take what are called the Einstein field equations, which are of general relativity, and you replace every quantity every observable. And observable in quantum mechanics is something that you can observe in laboratory. So it's like where something is, or how fast it is moving, or what energy it possesses. So position, momentum, and energy, these are quantities that are called observables. In quantum mechanics, every observable is replaced by its corresponding operator. And the operator decides that what results you are really going to get, what are the possible results of measurements of these observables on the particle. If you replace the observables in Einstein's field equations with operators and try to work out the field equations, they don't work out, and you are going to have infinities that cannot be cancelled out. So we don't have a quantum field theory of gravity. We have the general relativity, which is only a classical theory. So in terms of a quantum field, gravity cannot yet be explained. We do not have a complete quantum theory of gravity. In classical physics, it is very well explained by the general relativity, which works differently than the other forces work. So the true reason is we don't know what it is that makes gravity different from the other forces, that makes it work classically and the other forces quantum mechanically.
Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Walaikum assalam.
It's me, Muhammad Samiul Wasim from Rohispunj. Sir, my question is that how we can apply Newton's second law in a system where mass varies with time, such as rocket in a flight.
My apologies. Could you restate it?
Sir, my question is that how we can apply Newton's second law in a system where mass varies with time. Sir, how we can apply Newton's second law in a system
Mass varies
where
with
mass
time.
varies with time?
All right. Thanks for the restatement. So the thing is that Newton's second law in its general form is not F equals ma. It really is F equals dp over dt. That is, the force is the rate at which momentum of a system changes with time, not quit that the force is equal to mass times acceleration. So all you have to do is state what the momentum at any given time is and write it in terms of time, write the mass in terms of time, and well, you have this formula for momentum that you have built up. Momentum is simply mass times velocity. Mass itself is a function, not a constant. So you can't take it out of the d over dt and multiply by dv over dt. And so the force now is simply d over dt of m times v. When you have the rate at which mass is changing with time, you multiply that by the velocity, and then you differentiate it, and then that will be the force. So instead of using ma, you have to directly use dp over dt in its original form. That way it works out.
Sir, I have one more question. I have one doubt that, sir, you told that related to gravitational law, that everybody in a universe have a attractive force. Then even a tilly small ball have a attractive force. But sir, why in charges there is repulsive force? In the same charges there is repulsive force.
Well, gravity, mind you, is also repulsive. Gravity is not always attractive. There is this thing called repulsive gravity that we call dark energy. And trust me, I hate this terminology that you call it dark energy, which is why I always consider the more scientific term, you call it the cosmological constant. What dark energy really is, first of all, it is not some form of energy. Secondly, it is not dark because energy is not something that you can see. So it is really bad naming at its best. What cosmological constant really does is, it brings it, every object in the universe is moving farther away from each other. Why is that? Because the space-time is intrinsically curved that way. As I told you, gravity is a result of space-time curvature. And masses do curve space-time, but even besides that, space-time is intrinsically curved and it drives everything away. So this is something of an example of what you call repulsive gravity. Regarding why matter, so if you consider dark energy separately, the cosmological constant separately, because that is due to the intrinsic curvature of space-time. If you try to understand why matter only attracts, because, well, you can really understand it that way, that if you want information to propagate between two objects and it has to propagate at a rate that is slower than the speed of light, in this case, it is at exactly the speed of light. So the way the space and the time transform themselves in the frames of these bodies does really govern how the bodies are going to interact with each other. Space and time transform themselves in such a manner that the two objects appear to be closing in. So if you try to understand it as a result of space-time transformation, the way space and time transform into each other, so objects come closer in. since I told you that gravity is not understood as unlike electromagnetic force as some sort of force, but is space-time curvature itself, you have to look at it in the context of that only. So it's due to the transformation of space-time that objects close in naturally, and it is due to the cosmological constant that they will naturally drift apart as well, that the universe expands. On the other hand, the electromagnetic force, the charges of the electromagnetic force, well, this force is propagated by particles called photons, and it is really a quantum mechanical effect why some charges attract and some charges repel. So it is a difference of, you have the quantum mechanical law here and you have a classical law of space-time curvature here.
Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Walaikum assalam.
I am Asma Jahangir from Rohisius Punch. So my question is, since the gravitational force and electrostatic force both follows the same inverse square law, right? With the gravitational depending on mass and electrostatic depending on charge, right? So is there any fundamental relationship or symmetry between both mass and charge?
Well, that's a very interesting question. If there is some fundamental relation between mass and charge, but the answer is that they arise out of different fields. So everything that you see around you is really an excitation of some sort of quantum field. So we again run into the troubles of quantum gravity. So the answer is again, I mean, much of the answers to all of the questions that you students have asked is that we don't know. And this is one case of that only. If you were to truly describe some fundamental relation between mass and charge, you have to really understand mass due to some mass due to some quantum field and charge due to some quantum field. We do understand mass in terms of quantum fields, and that is one very good thing that, well, I can speak of right now, and that is that mass is really an excitation of what you call the Higgs field. So not everything, but in fact a lot of things in the universe do have masses because they interact with the Higgs field. And well, the Higgs field is one quantum field. Why do objects have charges? Why do electrons have charges, you may ask? It's like, well, one answer could be, why could it not have charges? But a more physics-based or mathematical answer should be, it itself is an excitation of the electromagnetic field. The electron is an excitation of the electron field, by the way. So there is a corresponding electron field. So electron itself is a field, itself a quantum field. And so, since it is really quantum fields that governs everything, this is why there are relations between masses and charges. And so the classical gravitational force is given in terms of mass and the classical electromagnetic force in terms of the charges. The answer is that the mass itself is an excitation of a quantum field and the charge is also an excitation of the quantum field. So there are the same laws that govern masses and charges, which is why they're similar.
Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Walaikum assalam.
Sir, I am a physics mentor. I would like to ask a question related to energy and mass. It's a very simple question and the last question. We know that Einstein's equation E is equal to mc square, right? When I was taking the class, even sometimes I feel to explain E is equal to mc square, it's correct or not. And you know, there are a lot of controversies are going on. So I need some explanation to explain to my students regarding that.
Well, first of all, it isn't the complete formula, by the way. So it isn't the complete formula unless you count what is called the relativistic mass. And the relativistic mass is one concept that has already been discarded from the physics community. So even though you'll find them in older textbooks or even more recent textbooks, relativistic mass is not a well accepted concept in the physics community. So we speak only of mass and we say that mass is invariant of speed. That even if you're moving at a certain speed, mass does not change. You cannot speak of relativistic mass. You only speak of rest mass. In that case, what equals mc square really means is that every body that has a rest mass, also possesses by virtue of that some energy that you call the rest energy. What is this? Well, this is the rest mass of that object times the speed of light square. And this is intrinsic to the body. Whatever it does, it simply exists. And it has some rest mass. It means it has that energy. If you consider a more complete formula, it is that the energy square is equal to mc square whole square plus pc whole square. This refers to the kinetic energy of a body even when it is in a motion. So it is like a complete energy. It includes kinetic energy and it includes the rest energy of the body by this equation. So I think there are lots of misconceptions regarding the equation. Why it doesn't work out for a photon, for instance? A photon has zero mass, light has zero mass. How come light possesses energy? That is because light is always in motion. So light always has momentum. So you put in 0 as the rest mass and you have the equation E square equals PC whole square. So that means E equals PC, and we know that is a correct formula, right? You then have PC equals H times you have the frequency of light, and so we have the de Broglie relation, the de Broglie wavelength or the frequency. So first of all, we need to understand that the equation refers only to rest masses, and it simply means that anything that has mass has energy corresponding to that. And why does it have that energy? That is one question that we might ask, and indeed a very good question. And this is because everything in the universe travels through space-time at the same speed, at the speed of light. And so, since we know that energy of a body is but the time component of the momentum of the body, really. So now you cannot speak in terms of 3 dimensions, you have to speak in 4 dimensions. When you take the x component of momentum, you get some value. So for the y and z component of the momentum, the time component of linear momentum of a body is the energy of that body. That means that the rest energy of a body really refers to the body when it is at rest in space, but it is still moving through time, right? Because the body moves through time, it has to possess that energy. So the rest energy of the body is the kinetic energy actually that the body possesses when it moves through time. So that is really how you explain it.
Thank you so much.